Okay, good afternoon, colleagues and panelists. It's a privilege to be moderating this session. We understand that the original moderator, Dr. Fushi, has taken ill, and I'm sure everybody will join me in wishing him very best wishes for a speedy recovery. I'm very pleased to be able to welcome, in no particular order, Pierre van der Hoeven, who is an experienced entrepreneur with considerable experience in the media sector, amongst others. And in the recent past, he's focused on the cannabis and hemp sector, both with respect to legislation, policy, investment, and job creation and growth in the sector, and has personally set up a number of companies. And it is safe to say he's a recognized expert in the emerging South African hemp and cannabis industry or sector. Ayanda Bam has, I have to say, an extraordinary CV with a distinguished academic background and considerable experience in banking and finance, in management consulting to governments and the private sector in, I think it's somewhere in the region of 25 countries around the world. He serves on the board of the Federation of Industrial Hemp Associations and Friends of Hemp South Africa. And Ayanda represents industry on the South African Cannabis Master Plan Committee. We also are very privileged to have in the discussion Tony Baden, who is a lifelong industrial cannabis and hemp activist and lobbyist, who is widely recognized not just in South Africa but globally as an industry expert, including the fact that in the US Cannabis Business Awards, Tony has been recognized as one of the top 100 cannabis influencers globally. He's a founder of Hemporium, Africa's oldest company in the sector, and is an activist, lobbyist, advocacy campaigner, and industry expert. And so we're very welcome to welcome Tony and Ayanda and Pierre. A few words just to frame today's discussion. All the panelists, as I've said, are industry experts, but with far wider knowledge and experience in finance, in economics, in industrial policy, investment, entrepreneurship, and so on and so forth. The Africa Rising narrative places agriculture and agro-processing and new so-called sunrise sectors, high value-added agricultural crops such as high value-added vegetable, fruit, and nut manufacturing as an example of a sunrise sector with considerable capabilities. The history of industrialization throughout the world is a history where initially agriculture and agro-processing has paved the way for skills development, investment, exports, with considerable multiplier effects across the economy. Obviously, cannabis, apart from the other well-known agricultural sunrise sectors, demonstrates very high potential, especially for Africa. And Africa has considerable competitive advantages, including the fact that it has vast resources with respect to unused arable and often water-rich land. It has considerable human resources with a growing population and demand, and significant export opportunities. It also has significant challenges, which we're all aware of, and these are with respect, amongst other things, to its structural resource dependency, the infrastructure weaknesses, skills constraints, and political economy uncertainty and constraints. The work, amongst others, of the renowned development economists, John Sender and Chris Kramer, and together with the minister responsible for industry in Ethiopia, Akebe Akubai, have set out in very interesting books, one of which is called Made in Africa, the opportunities for agriculture and value-added manufacturing. And they advocate a value chain approach to the sunrise sectors, which they call the industrialization of agriculture. The hemp and cannabis sector is one amongst other sunrise sectors, as I've indicated, which has considerable potential across the value chain. But African governments, unfortunately, our own government in South Africa included, have been slow to provide a policy, legislative, and regulatory framework to support investment, the establishment of primary production and value-added manufacturing in admittedly a complex policy and legislative environment with multiple cultural, political, economic, and social issues and imperatives. And so it is against this background that we're very privileged to have three leading industry experts to speak on this topic. And so in no particular order or priority, I'd like to start with Pierre van der Hoeven to give us his introductory remarks, to be followed by Ayanda, and for Tony to end. And after that, I will try my best to manage a question and answer session where hopefully we would be able to arrive at some of the critical issues, constraints, proposals, opportunities to unlock the hemp and cannabis opportunities in South Africa, create investment wealth, address poverty, and the crying need for employment opportunities, amongst other considerations in South Africa. So without further ado, over to you, Pierre.
Great, Garth, thanks very much for that kind introduction, and thank you to the Indaba for honoring me by letting me speak at this Indaba. I'm going to start with a very broad overview of cannabis. Cannabis is a plant. It's got a lot of uses, and the scope of the plant is extensive. In terms of business opportunities, there's a number of sectors, and they're in various degrees of legalization. Firstly, there's medical cannabis. Companies can apply to SAPRA. They can get a Section 22 license. It's mainly for export under medical standards. The barriers to entry are very high in that sector of the industry, but it remains an exciting sector of the industry. In terms of private use of cannabis in South Africa, our Constitutional Court has allowed passed a ruling in September 2018. Private use is legal, but no trade is allowed. So adult use and recreational use is not legal yet. So we're not going to really talk about that. And the last remaining sector is really the hemp sector. And the focus of my introduction is definitely going to be on hemp. And where we are with the hemp sector is we're waiting for the regulations. There were draft regulations issued in October this year, but they were subsequently withdrawn. But we do have a pretty good idea about how the permitting regime is going to work around hemp, unless there are changes we don't know about. So let's just talk a little bit about the potential of hemp. Africa loves cannabis and cannabis loves Africa. There's a long history of cannabis cultivation across the continent. It's deeply embedded in culture and society. And in fact, we have a massive existing industry in the adult use market, where South Africa has been supplying product for over 80 years. What's significant about that is it's a product that has a customer, and they've been buying for many, many years. So we should never forget that it's a new industry legally, but it is actually embedded in an industry that has existed for a long time. Hemp has the potential to be one of the largest industries in the world, and I'm sure my other colleagues are going to go into detail about the uses around hemp. I'm not going to spend a lot of time in that area. Just to say it's very multifaceted and incredibly extensive. Hemp can be used for medical use, industrial use, and there are massive opportunities, for example, in replacement of fossil fuels and in climate change and the green economy. And because of that, there's a huge employment potential. And as we know, that's a critical issue in our country. The challenges, it's very early stages in the industry. The legal process is still underway. We have to change the Drug and Drug Control Act because that declares that the plant and all plants thereof is illegal. We're still unclear about hemp for CBD, which is a pity because that is a massive part of the industry in America. And we're really hoping that we get some attention from around hemp for CBD. The current legislation, there's some real problems there. And the biggest one is the low levels of THC. And then there's some vague ones that can be addressed, like suitable fences. And, what does that really mean? From my perspective as a business person, the critical issue is the development of the value chain. And in terms of hemp, we really need to build some factories. Otherwise, people are not going to plant unless they have a market. So the potential's there. The processing facilities, there's a lot of numbers flying around. And one of the problems with the new industry is that a lot of the numbers are unknown. But, a processing facility can generate between 100 and 150 jobs. And it's estimated we need a lot of them in South Africa. And we'll get into some numbers about how many we really need. The industry, there's space for everybody. There's a lot of opportunity, and I suggest we work together. We need the government to speed up. We need cooperation between the private sector and the government. And the economic opportunity there is massive. I would also argue that we need to approach our cannabis and hemp industry from a South African perspective and not simply follow what's happened internationally. We have our own unique requirements such as poverty alleviation, rural economic development, job creation, and we should really, as an industry, focus on that. So yeah, in summary, I think I'll stop there. Thanks, Garth. Thanks for the introduction.
Thank you very much, Pierre. Ayanda, can I hand over to you?
Yes, thank you very much, Pierre, and hello to the other members of the panel. It's very nice to be able to engage with you on this platform as well. And thank you very much to the Indaba for inviting me. I think, rarely do you get an opportunity in any life of an economy where you have in effect, all of the ingredients that can give you some of the most transformational kind of outputs without sort of some of the constraints of kind of a legacy other than sort of the stigma that's attached to the plant. But I think what excites us the most about cannabis is really it's the opportunity to be truly transformative in the way we think about industrialization in the 21st century. There are a number of obviously key objectives, right, that we have to really align ourselves with, which is that, of course, the hemp or cannabis industry has to exist within an actual context. And particularly in the case of South Africa, is one in which we are looking to build the kinds of value chains that are inclusive, that are transformational, that are profitable, but also provide commercial basis for the meaningful participation of the poor and the marginalized in this country. I have to agree with what Pierre has said, which is that the opportunity is really across the board, and it is for every imaginable sector. I think what's happening globally, and I think this is how hemp sort of fits into a broader picture, not just around sort of the products that we can make, because that's, of course, a very exciting topic. But I think it's also around situating hemp within a broader kind of discussion around what that industrialization looks like. It's against the backdrop, for example, of this just transition towards a low carbon economy and what that means around not leaving others behind. But this is particularly important given the kinds of applications that hemp and cannabis have towards greening industrial processes, towards the rehabilitation of degraded environments, the ability to generate energy, et cetera, that are really very massive and I think are a part of a broader and I think what's going to be a dominant economic model, which is really the circular economy. And that's what we're likely to have for the next couple of decades. I think the other thing that's very interesting on in general over the last couple of years, but particularly with the onset of COVID. So on the one hand, the disruption to global supply chains, that's really brought back to the fore the discussions around localizations and the opportunities for some import substitution. That's something that's really important, and especially because I don't think I or anybody else on the panel have really encountered any countries, for example, that have looked to build meaningful cannabis sectors that are entirely export oriented, which is effectively what we have here with the regulation. So the importance of really thinking about how do you establish a solid local market that is able to absorb all of various products, but that also has the ability to engage competitively with the rest of the globe. I think a couple of other issues for us that are really key is that you have large numbers, not just in South Africa, but in the rest of the continent, large numbers of smallholder farmers who are really seeking some opportunity to diversify their livelihoods. And the kind of technically complex plant that you get out of cannabis and the ability to use the whole plant for various applications is one that offers significant opportunities for the building resilience of these livelihoods. It's also particularly interesting for our region in the Southern Cone, where you've had traditional tobacco farmers, for example, who now need to be transitioned into sort of these new sunrise or more productive areas of the economy. So those are some of the areas that I think are going to be particularly key for us. The employment one is, of course, a really massive one. And it's certainly, we think the massive opportunities exist, not just at the production level where there are opportunities to integrate farmers, but I think particularly when you think about manufacturing, how you start moving some of that agriculture up the value chain. And I'm not the biggest value chain analysis fan, in large part because that just tells you about how value is added across the life cycle. But actually some of the other things that we need to be thinking about are these political economy considerations, right, that allow industries to actually function. So what are the various power dynamics? You know, we have a long provenance of cannabis growing here, but where folks have over centuries developed these unbelievable landrace genetics. But over the last couple of decades, we have an enormous amount of biopiracy. And with the entrenchment, for example, of a global seed industry that's dominated by 4 companies, it makes it really difficult to sort of, imagine a space in which, indigenous knowledge and the protection of that intellectual property sort of competes against sort of some of the real big players. But these are considerations certainly that are not just unique to South Africa, but ones that we need to really take, proper cognizance of. The final thing I'll just say is that we are also very realistic around some of the ambitions that we have. Building up an industry from scratch is an extraordinary effort. And I think it's important for us also to be realistic around what the viability looks like across sort of a maturity cycle. You know, there are opportunities that we're able to leverage in some complementary and adjacent sectors. I mean, the agriculture one is certainly one. The automotive could be another, clothing and textiles. And I think what's happened, unfortunately, is that the way that we've seen or really tackled this industry is not so much as an industry itself and thinking about all the various components that come to sort of build up a functional industry, but also thinking about, okay, we don't have to eat this whole elephant up whole. There are ways in which we can think about, well, what do we start off with now? But the important thing is really to get started. And I think that's at least for some of us who are in the hemp industry, that's really a message that I think folks like Tony Baden, who've been around for a long time, have really stressed is actually get started, build up the momentum. Let's use the opportunity to be able to learn, to grow, and to adjust. And I think that's something that's a little bit missing in South Africa. We're moving too slowly and there are too many barriers at the moment. But overall, a super exciting industry, one that's really, really relevant to the growth and development of our country.
Thank you so much, Ayanda. Very interesting strategic issues that you've raised, which we'll pick up on in the discussion. Last but certainly not least, over to you, Tony.
Thanks, Garth, and Pierre and Ayanda, thank you so much, both of you, for your insights and highlighting some of the issues and challenges that we're going to have. And being a veteran, this is my 25th year of being in this space. And I can honestly say when we launched Emporium 25 years ago, we did not think we would still be importing our raw materials 25 years later. And we're still in that situation where our textiles come from the East, our oils and seeds come from Europe, CBD comes from the States, building materials from UK. And that is, for us, an untenable situation. It leads, obviously, to a level of frustration that I battle sometimes to swallow in situations like these, because I've seen South Africa lose so many opportunities. And I know as a country, often we try to see ourselves as the regulators or the regulated part of the region, but sometimes you can be left standing on the dock still packing your bags while you're waiting for everything to be right and the ship sails away from you. So there is a silver lining to that statement, though, that we can learn from others' mistakes. We have put ourselves on the back foot now coming into this industry at a very late stage where we could have been a world leader. We started research in South Africa around 1995, 1996, and we could have beaten Canada to it. We could have beaten Australia, UK, and really been a world leader in the sector. And through waiting to get regulations 100% right and various other political reasons, as Pierre highlighted, that we are now starting from the back. Europe is full. Canada is even fuller of hemp and cannabis. The States the borders are closed. It's still not federally legal in a lot of sectors. And we have to, and we'll stress this, all of us, create a local market. And that's why this Indaba is incredibly important. We're not just speaking about cultivation here. There's been a lot of talk about cultivating cannabis. A lot of push on how easy it is a plant to grow. It's like a weed. You can just cultivate that. And that is not exactly true, especially when you bring standards and quality control into the game and traceability. But we know that there is a list as long as my arm of farmers and traditional growers who all can cultivate. We are going to, as soon as they open the floodgates for cultivation, we are going to have mountains of hemp and cannabis in this country. What do we do with that? Who is going to come to that farm gate and say to these farmers, I will buy what you've grown? Because it's very hard to sell just bales of hemp stalk or unprocessed seeds, uncleaned seeds. Us as Emporium, we can't sell that. We're not a processor. So this is really the missing link. This Indaba, this sector is what we need to get right. Taking those raw materials and turning them into sellable goods that then can enter the market, that have quality control, that have been produced properly, that enable us then to compete on an international level, where we're not just doing business as usual and trying to sell our raw material off to China or off to Europe, and then they do all the value add. We have to develop this value chain locally. And not just copy what they've done in Europe, where they have massive decortication facilities, which are the facilities that take the fiber off the stalk, that separate the two main parts of the stalk. So you can have your building materials or animal bedding going one way in what's called the herd, and your fiber going the other way, which goes to paper, goes to textiles, and that it's an essential part of the hemp industry. But someone needs to do that. And it's not going to work on a centralized model. We need to have small-scale decortication machines developed for South Africa. We have such a huge country. We can't have everything in one place and you're shipping bales of stalks to them. It has to happen as close to farm level or cooperative level as possible. And we have the engineers in this country. We have the experience of developing a boer maak 'n plan, of developing machinery that can really be used at farm level. And we're seeing this happen now in America, where they've legalized hemp a few years ago through the farm bill. And there are companies working on small-scale decorticators. We have to look at the food side. I'd love to see a model for hemp seed oil, not based on all growers of hemp seed sell it to one big oil press who then homogenizes hemp seed oil that gets sold generically. I'd love to see it set up on a level like olive oil, where every farm can have their own press, their own food safe processes, that out of the farm comes Tilbach Valley organic hemp seed oil that's been grown from a specific variety that has a better flavor than what's available on the mass market. These kind of leapfrogs of looking at our products and being able to speak to a local market as well, because the other frustration with having to import that we've been relying on is we've stuck in this niche of very eco-minded people who can afford to buy hemp seed oil with the optimum ratio of omega fatty acids, but they're paying over 100 Rand for 250 mils. Who can afford that? If you're growing here and you're processing locally on a smaller scale, it can compete definitely with olive oil and hopefully even in the future down to sunflower oil levels. We're looking at CBD at the moment, importing it from the States, people paying 750 to 1,000 Rand for a little bottle that lasts you a month. If we can get it, and we've done the calculations, if we can get it down to 250, 350 Rand a month at the same margins that we're getting on the imported stuff, we'd be able to have a market that's similar to a vitamin market, where lots of people can afford to take CBD on a daily basis as a supplement. So I would like to see us focusing on developing local value chains, developing the local market, educating consumers, and immediately as an industry, put our teeth into that, building regional local markets, developing the products locally, doing all the value add, and then looking at export. Because in my mind, we've missed that export boat. So if we are going to make a success of this industry, it's all hands on deck to develop the local processing equipment, to build the factories regionally, to get those value chains and into different brands, local brands. We've got a few that are already established. We've got obviously Hemporium, our own brand, 25 years on. We've got brands like Goodleaf, also proudly South African developed. We have so much available in this country as far as engineering, processing, the skills. The CSIR is still, they've got a lot of data on processing hemp that we can see put into place. And then we have the market that wants eco-friendly clothing, that wants good housing, that needs supplements like CBD, that need protein and omega fatty acids that the hemp seed can offer. That is the market. The demand is here, but we have to produce it in a way that they can afford it. It's not seen as a niche. It's not seen as a eco-friendly product. It's something that we can offer as a staple and compete. Then when we get to the economies of scale, we can compete with brick and cement for housing. We can compete with the other oils, as a oil that we use on a daily basis. So it's really that I cannot stress that harder, that local is lacquer in this case. Developing locally developed machinery that we know that can be used on the smaller scale. Like it's something we've done before when we were isolated from the world, and it's something I think we can definitely do again. Make sure that this is a self-sufficient industry focused on local growers supplying a local market, and the export market will come once we have developed those products, but not to just think that this is going to be the first thing. And some Canadian millionaire is going to be at your farm gate saying, I'll buy everything you can grow. That's not going to happen anymore. It's our local people that need and want these products, and that's who we have to speak to.
Thank you very much, Tony, and thank you to Pierre and Ayanda. I think the combined total of the three inputs has given our audience a very good high-level picture of the sector, the opportunities, perhaps the constraints as well. Please feel free to ask any questions yourselves, but allow me to perhaps pose the first question in a particular context. In a previous life, I was the Deputy Director General of Industrial Development at the DTIC. I saw two successful sectors, both mature, both with deeply embedded stakeholders. In the case of automotives, the global OEMs domiciled in South Africa, and global and domestic suppliers. In the case of clothing and textiles, similarly, large textile manufacturers and very mature clothing manufacturers. These are mature sectors with clearly identified stakeholders, a long record of government policy, legislation, and policy certainty. These companies are embedded in global value chains, and both in automotives and clothing and textiles benefit from significant supply side support, tax incentives, and direct incentives. On the other hand, we've had two sunrise sectors which have failed. The one would be the manufacturing of renewables, both for solar as well as wind, with the implementation of the Renewable Energy Independent Power Producers Program. 5 companies set up in South Africa, and because of policy uncertainty, regulatory barriers, serious problems with demand, and most of that came from the state, all 5 companies have closed down. There's another sunrise sector, which is the biofuel sector. South Africa was well positioned, given its comparative advantages in agriculture with respect to sugarcane and a host of other products which could be converted to biofuels and mixed in fuels of various types for industry and vehicles and so on and so forth. Both sectors failed. And so, unfortunately, we, as a country, we've got a poor record of ensuring that an optimal policy, regulatory, and legislative framework enables the inception and growth of the sunrise sector. And it's staggering to hear that Tony's been working for 25 years in this sector. So my question to all of you is, we know that there's a master plan. Personally, I'm of the view that it's a start, but with a very long way to go. What should industry, the private sector, labor, communities be doing to push government towards the adoption, not of some grand plan, but, as I think has been said, the necessary incremental steps which need to be taken so that we don't miss the boat in the way that we did in relation to biofuels and renewables. And I think work in a collaborative effort with government to ensure that urgent steps are taken and taken to unlock the industry. That's a very high-level strategic question, and it's complex. But let me pose it to you as a panel, because I think it's the most important question. Over to you. Please just fire away. You don't have to raise a hand.
Okay, Garth, I'll try to answer that. Yeah, I think we're coming out of a very interesting set of circumstances which supports the political will, and I'm really hoping that will land sooner or later, because we haven't really had much success to date. But a lot of the voting base is in the areas that can benefit. We're not creating a new industry, we're just legalizing an industry. The other side is, as Tony said, we can learn from what's happened overseas. And there are a lot of lessons to be learned there, and there's an exceptional growth happening on a global basis under a very short time frame. So we really need to unite. And I think the government has failed quite dismally. But I must also say, I think the private sector has as well. There's no united industry body. So there's been a couple of problems. And it's been a rough build-up, but I think between the political will, the socio-imperatives, the private sector coming together, the global sector leading, the world is watching South Africa. And if you want to get positive input about the potential of the South African industry, ask people who don't live here, and they go, when South African comes online, they're going to be a real force to be reckoned with. But it's not without its problems, and I think the role that DTI played, and I will compliment you on that because I know about your background, was an absolutely critical part, and we need DTI in particular to take a leading role here and address us as an industrial manufacturing business employment issue, and not this fear driven by the stigma associated with the so-called dreaded drug called cannabis. So I think everything's in place, but we really need to understand that this ship is sailing. If we do not get our act together, we're going to be turned into farmers. I support everything about developing the local market, but it really needs to be done. And if I had to put the ticket in at one door, I would say it's got to be government has to create enabling regulations and legislation.
Yep. Yes, sorry, go for it, Ayanda.
Oh, okay. Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. Actually, I think the stumbling block for us in the cannabis industry really is around the regulatory burden. We don't have an enabling environment, and I think at the moment the expectation is that pretty specialist, like technical departments, now have to create the enabling environment for what is industrialization or commercialization considerations. So far, we understand kind of the historical reason for why that's been the case. The Department of Justice with the Drugs Act, the Medicines Act, and Department of Health, now with the Plant Improvement Act under the Department of Agriculture. But the problem is that regulatory environment is really quite fragmented. And I think part of the issue that I think in South Africa we face is that sometimes we have these grand visions around really collaborating and getting to a similar endpoint, and yet we don't actually collaborate. And so what you end up happening is you have this sort of discordance or disjointed sort of objectives. You have sort of three sets of legislation, and actually they don't speak to one another. And that's unfortunately the kind of situation that we're in. If we cannot disentangle some of that, we're going to have some real challenges, because if, for example, you have something classified as a drug or a narcotic, you therefore cannot get institutional financing for it. That's something that folks don't think about, in terms of allowing people to grow and whatnot. But all of the other things that are sort of support or enablers for the industry to function also need to be in place. And I think that's where we have something that's missing a little bit. And I too would like to see the DTIC a little bit more involved in sort of driving a lot more of this, because we also understand, for example, that the fiscus is actually constrained, and the expectation that government is actually going to be able to finance all of this, I think, is just wildly ambitious. And so we need to be able to make sure that there are ways in which we can set up the regulation so each of the different social partners, Garth, that you've mentioned, are able to play their appropriate roles. If the government enables the industry, the private sector is then able to actually step in to provide the various investments, the support that's required. At the moment, the regulations don't allow for that to happen fairly easily. Over to you, Tony.
Thanks. Yes, and I think a key word that all three of you have mentioned is this word enabling. Currently, what we're seeing from the regulators and then the draft, it's all about control. How strictly can we control this industry? And we do understand the legacy that we're taking on just the nature of the plant cannabis. But we've seen, as I said, many countries open the door before us, and all this fear that was put in that you're going to see the sky fall on Colorado's head after they've been legalizing, and all these vehicle accidents, and people are going to hide cannabis or weed in a hemp field, and it hasn't happened. And now we're looking at these draft regulations, and we're seeing 0.2% THC as the level. It's the lowest, pretty much the lowest in the world. Most of Europe is 0.3%. Switzerland is 1%. We looking at in the States, they're pushing for 1%. Australia, because we are doing our farmers a disservice by limiting them to those varieties that are less than 0.2%. Those varieties come from high up in Europe, cooler days, longer days, and they don't perform well. We only have to look at the data from the trials that we did from 2011 to 2015 that we've provided the government with, 6-7 years ago. We've told them 0.2% as well is very hard to achieve with our high UV, our extra stress the plants go under. We are going to have a situation where we will find farmers having to destroy their crops. Now, that's okay in a country like Canada where they've got subsidies, and Europe, subsidies for the farmers, and okay, they have to destroy a crop because it's 0.4 instead of 0.3 or whatever. In South Africa, that would destroy a small farmer. So that is, it's not, and it's also not like the government doesn't know. We've told them this, but they're doing the least possible to open the doors. But it's no good opening the doors if we know that we are setting up farmers for failure. That's not, I do want to see momentum, obviously, but I also care deeply about the industry, and I want to see it being built sustainably, and I don't want to see any well-meaning farmers lose their money, especially the small communities who are also now being told that they need a fence around their field. I've been to hemp farms in China, in Canada, in Europe, Netherlands. I've been all over the world, and I have not seen one hemp field that is surrounded by a fence, unless to protect it from the neighboring goats or something like that who come in. It is not necessary. It is a cost that is going to create a huge barrier of entry to small-scale farmers. So it's, you can imagine with hemp, it's not, your medical cannabis is horticulture. You can grow enough on a hectare to make a very sustainable business or profitable business. Hemp is agriculture. I wouldn't start it without 10, 20 hectares, at least. Now try and think of the fencing cost for 10, 20 hectares. That is going to destroy, again, these small farmers who have to cover that cost, or not be able to actually enter the sector without being able to put the fence up and not getting their license. So these barriers that are created by this control, that this fear of what happens if someone steals some hemp and sells it as cannabis. Well, that's an irrational argument, because anyone who sells something as a drug and it's not going to be around very long as a drug dealer, I can tell you that much. And the other idea of hiding marijuana or weed in a hemp field, it's the worst possible place because of cross-pollination. Hemp, you've got males and females, and with cannabis, high-grade cannabis, it's only the females. So there's certain aspects that we're not getting heard on, and it's not through lack of trying as an industry. We really have tried to engage, but I think Pierre mentioned something about the lack of kind of coordination amongst the industry. But one of the challenges we have is it's been used as a crucible to hold so many other conversations around the indigenous people's rights of the Pondo people in the Eastern Cape, the Rastafarian reparations for the war on them that they've had as people who've been custodians of this plant, and all the arrests and deaths that have been associated with that, with First Nations, with you've got commercial farmers, you've got young stoners, you've got extraction specialists, you've got so many different agendas coming into a fledgling industry that just needs to get off the ground and start growing and start developing. So it is a very challenging space, and I do have some empathy for the government on that side, because they don't know which stakeholders to engage in. But there is enough data from our trials here, there is enough data from international best practices to see that what they are doing right now is putting us at a disadvantage. Coming at it from a control angle instead of an enabling angle. I was part of the lobby group in Malawi, and just what I would highly recommend we look at in South Africa, which would uncomplicate things. We got through to the legislators that create an enabling act. The key part of the legislation must just be, this is the legalization of industrial cannabis or hemp, and this is the legalization of the cannabis industry. Very broad, very enabling. The regulations then can be more stringent. But as an evolving industry, we will need regulations to be changed easily. We don't want to go back to Parliament every time we want to change a THC level, or every time we want to take away the fence. Put that in the regulations. We can change regulations relatively easy, but create enabling legislation at the highest level with Parliament that just allows regulators at a departmental level, or at the different ministries, to be able to change those regulations as the industry evolves. And we see we've made some mistakes, because we will make some mistakes. So that to the regulators or to the legislators, don't overcomplicate the act. Don't try and get it perfect first time, because you're not going to do that. We have a complex country. We have multiple different growing and cultivation environments. We need to be able to change our regulations on the fly. And that will really help to create an enabling environment.
Thank you very much, Tony, and Ayanda and Pia. Please feel free as panelists to come in with additional strategic and tactical questions, and just raise your hand. But can I follow that up with an additional question? In mature sectors, two of which I've spoken about, the organized industry literally gets on the phone and speaks to the president where there's a problem. Our problem, or the problem in the cannabis and hemp industry, as I'm sure you all acutely aware of, is that in the sunrise sector you have multiple complex stakeholders, stakeholder relationships, interests, special plea interests, a sense often legitimate of entitlement for a wide range of reasons. And as much as the DTIC and government should be putting in place the appropriate enabling regulatory policy and legislative framework, I think the reality is that that might happen, and if it happens, it may happen slowly. So what do we do in circumstances of a sunrise sector to make our voice, or the voice of the combined stakeholders in the hemp and cannabis industry, really heard and taken seriously? Media, advocacy, education, direct action, and so on and so forth. As well as, I personally have yet to see a well-articulated, data-rich modeling exercise of the extent to which an enabling environment which secures investment can address the critical problem that we're all aware of, which is rural poverty, inequality, lack of economic activities in rural areas. So therefore, my question to you is not about a grand plan, which is necessary, but what are the incremental steps? How does the broader sector place much greater pressure on government to deliver? How do we support government to put this enabling environment in place? And how do we ensure that, as Ayanda said, the most marginalized in the process are placed center stage in the development of the sunrise sector? And within that, how does organized big pharma participate, or big manufacturing corporates? Because unfortunately, the reality in our world is that those big players have muscle and they carry a voice. Over to you, colleagues, and please feel free to add and adjust the question as you see.
So Garth, I'll jump in here. I won't be long, colleagues. I try to start an industry association, and the problem is there's no money in the sector. It's a startup sector. There's no money. In many other industries, the government has put money into funding the development of the sector. However, when it comes to cannabis, the poorest of the poor are expected to mobilize off their own resources, and it is simply unacceptable, and it's causing huge issues. I'm also a joint CEO of an investment company, and let me give you an example, which is quite an interesting one. The regulator says you have to build a 20 million rand facility before you can apply for a license. But the financial sector says, unless you have a license, you can't apply for money. So we now have an industry that's stuck in a catch-22. The private sector needs to also be proactive in this industry and help and contribute to the development of the industry, I mean, particularly the investment community. What you've effectively done with this recent example is the only people that can afford to get into the medical cannabis facility and build a facility are the already very wealthy. They're not funded by the banks. They're not funded by investment companies. They're funded by angel investors to a large extent. So it's there's structural issues here. But again, my short solution is fix up the regulations, make them enabling. Private sector will then come to the party. The private sector, I did a consulting job for a bank. It went to their risk committee, their ethics committee, and eventually they turned around and said it's illegal at a state level, at a federal level in the USA. We will not touch this industry unless you've got a license. So again, we're going around in circles. I would again hope that the government, in some form, maybe via the IDC or some DFI, would take a lead, put some money into it, use that to get a representative process so that each constituency feels heard, and then take it from there.
Okay, I'd like to hear Tony and Ayanda and Pierre, with great respect. Hope may not be a strategy, and hoping that government will do something which they haven't done after 25 years might not be the way to go. What are the practical steps that the private sector and the community sector and labor should be doing to assist government? We know that there's a master plan process in NEDLAC, and I think that's an important development, but it needs to be speeded up. But, you know, I think we must be quite careful about, in a sense, hoping that government at some point is going to come to the table, because all the signs are that it's not. Tony, Ayanda?
So I think Ayanda will probably speak to, but he's got a good concept with the Federation of Associations. So there are several associations, the Cannabis Development Council of South Africa, the Cannabis Trade Association of Africa, that have formed, and all with various agendas coming at it from various angles, some on making sure that we, even at Fields of Green for All, they're really looking at also stopping the harms of the war on drugs, arrests starting there, making sure that the trauma around the industry is stopped there. So to create a federation of associations, I'm sure Ayanda will speak to it, is a good idea. Then we can start getting an apex to speak to the government. Because as I said, I do have some sympathy with so many voices coming at them that they don't know who to listen to on that regard. But I would also, Pierre was right to say that the people who want to invest should already start investing, not waiting for the government to do the job. Invest in these associations. Give us, at the moment, they're all funded by small businesses who have some interest or advocates in that, and self-funded. There's no money in it, institutional money. So very little that we can do to try and, maybe instigate a court case to get the government to do what they're supposed to do, or hopefully we don't have to go that way. But it seems that sometimes that's what makes government jump. If we look at the Constitutional Court case, that's what actually really got things moving. Not moving fast enough, because Concord gave government 24 months, and we are more than 36 months later, and we're still waiting. But these are considerations. If government isn't doing what they're supposed to do, what they constitutionally mandated to do, we might have to go back to court. And no one wants to do that. But to have the resources to be able to do that, it does help, and it does seem to get a response. But obviously, first prize is to have proper stakeholder engagement from the government, not a Zoom call with 400 different members that lasts a morning and everyone trying to get their voice in, like we had recently on the master plan comment. That's not stakeholder engagement, and not writing the documents before you've engaged with the industry and the stakeholders. Let them be part of that process, because once the government's done the work once, they're reticent to do it again. So they think, okay, here's something, we'll put a few comments in and now it will be right. It's not like that. We're the ones with the experience. We've been part of this. We've invested in it. We have a vision for how this industry can work. We've researched best practices in Canada and Europe. We know that Africa has its own challenges, and South Africa specifically. We're the ones who really want to get this right. We don't want to see it opened up and then closed down because of an abuse of the system or people putting substandard products out there that harm people. None of us have that intention. We want to do it right. We're not scared of regulations, but we want enabling regulations. We understand that if we're putting food products into the market, they need to meet your quality control, just like every other industry. And we're just asking to be treated the same. But as you said, I think it was Pierre who said, the government often funds startup or sunrise industries with some startup capital, to get going, to do, to help with the master plan development. At the moment, it's running on a shoestring for an industry that really can bring so much potential and so much returns, jobs, houses, food, medicine, as we said earlier. So many sectors can be influenced, and that we're not seeing investment, both from private sector who will invest once it's legal, and from government sources of funding, is, in my mind, it's a tragedy, and it is leaving us standing on the dock watching the ship sail away. But I remain incredibly hopeful. And I know you said, Garth, hope is in action, or it's not enough. It does drive us, though, and especially those of us who've invested enough to have a vision for what this industry can bring South Africa. Who hold this vision, and it is a vision of a greener economy, of sustainable houses, of jobs in factories where you're not dealing with substances that are going to ruin your lungs, or lead you to having to retire at a young age because you're working with toxins the whole time. And nutrition that is not functional. It's not just food. It actually brings healing at the same time. And medicine that you don't need to take a whole lot of other substances just to deal with the side effects of your medicine. there's so many aspects to what this plant can bring, and to see it move from the devil's gift to God's green gift, from the devil's weed to God's green gift. That's what we've got to do, is change our mindset to see this is really a gift. It really is. It's not something that we need to ban. It's not something that we need to criminalize. It's something that we will look over the last 100 years as the dark ages of this plant. It's been with us for over 10,000 years as a companion plant, and it's coming back, whether the government likes it or not. But every year that we miss, like right now, we're waiting for Department of Agriculture to release forms so that farmers can apply for this year. It's planting season now. The seasons don't wait for government. So we're missing another year just by the slow process of regulation. And we're doing a disservice to our farmers. We're doing a disservice to our manufacturing industry for something we know is coming. It's not, you can't hold it out anymore through conservative inaction. It is coming, and its time is past already. It's definitely now. So I think more action from investors, definitely. People who are waiting on the sideline, and I can guarantee you there are many people waiting for legalization. Invest already. Put your money in. Support the industry bodies, support the lobbyists, the advocates. And then from government, let's put a bit of resources into this and not see it purely from a control angle. This is something that, there's definitely a sunrise sector, but the thing is, the sun's already risen in other areas. It's shining brightly, and let's use some of that energy and some of that light to really leapfrog forward and create broad daylight for the sector.
Okay, thanks so much, Tony. Ayanda, please come in. And what I'm trying to get to is, I think we're all in agreement that this is an incredible sector with enormous potential, and that the critical constraint is the enabling regulatory and policy environment. But I think the key thing is that hoping government's going to do things isn't a strategy. And so the key question is, how do we assist government to develop a strategy and an incremental program? Is it a demonstrator effect of existing investments? Is it direct action where 10,000 small farmers meet the president? Or what is it? Is it a modeling exercise which demonstrates the multiplier economic effects? Over to you, Ayanda.
Thanks very much for that, Garth. I would say it's actually a combination of those things. I think what's been missing for the longest time has been the opportunity for the private sector to actually be a part of shaping what the industry ends up looking like. So the first thing that we must do is be active participants in that co-creation process. So where the opportunity is there to be able to engage with government and with other social partners, that is certainly something that we need to be able to do. But what we need to do in those engagements is to make sure that we are also quite prepared around, what are the things that we are actually willing to give up, for the first couple of years. How are we seeing a plan of incremental change over long periods of time? That's the first thing that I would say. I think the second thing that's really important is, as part of the broad advocacy, is that you realize that you've got a plant that is enormously complex, and where the touch points are a number of different governments and different expertise. But something that we've actually realized is, with all due respect, some of the knowledge base around cannabis is really low. And part of the advocacy effort is actually part of a re-education, particularly bringing cannabis out from the stigma and making sure we're equipping those who are making decisions on our behalf with exactly the kind of knowledge and evidence that they require to make appropriate decisions. That's really, really a key area. I think thinking of that more broadly around the sort of the propaganda, if you like, is that I would love to be able to live in a country in which the average citizen is equipped to be able to speak intelligibly and compellingly about the benefits of cannabis to the industrial base in South Africa, or really even more importantly, to their own lives. So there's a really great importance to make sure that we're able to have more enlightened conversations moving beyond, in the early days of doing a lot of these engagements. I think Pierre and Tony can attest to this, but the number of times you have to explain the difference between THC and CBD, we need to be able to elevate that conversation now towards, well, what does that actually mean, right, for industrial policy? How do we establish ourselves? The other thing, unfortunately, is that failing the advocacy effort and some of the communication and increasing the knowledge base, one has to look at litigation. And it is sort of the unfortunate route that we have to take, given sometimes the lethargy with which government has sort of approached development in the industry. It is something that is extremely costly. It can be quite ugly. We think it's fairly counterproductive, but the unfortunate trend in South Africa is that the only way that the legislature has been able to move is if they have very clear direction from the judiciary to do so. And so the Concord ruling of 2018 was exactly, there was not going to be any movement outside of that, because I don't think you have sort of this great enlightenment around, what this imagined cannabis like future can look like across any of the departments. The other thing that I would say is really important. I'll just touch two more things. The first one is around having all of these various parties actually try and get their elected officials and actually go out and ask folks, how are you thinking about cannabis development? When you're thinking about a post-COVID, economic revitalization strategy, where does cannabis fit into that? How can I participate in this? Where are the opportunities for government to be able to make revenues? Where are the opportunities for people to be able to, start up businesses? That's something that's really, really important. But one thing that I've noticed also and have learned is that it's really difficult to ask people to have a broad imagination about things. Some of us on this panel have had the privilege of engaging with the sector internationally, where you have these advanced economies and advanced technologies and tons of money going into the sector. When you don't have that kind of exposure, it's really difficult, right, for you to sort of imagine beyond the construct of possibility. I think what's really required in South Africa, especially something that brings together the different parties, is not just around the organizing. Now, I am a big believer in the idea of being able to organize, right? And so that we have sort of this one apex organization. But I think the other risk that you really face when you try to establish the bodies in advance of the industries, because generally associations are free-forming institutions based on market players. But when you don't have those market players, where you don't have that access, it means that you already entrench or embed certain kinds of vested interests before the industry even has the opportunity to get some legs. So there are some drawbacks to that. But I think the single biggest thing that we need in South Africa is a demonstrator. Could we have some provision to be able to actually show to every member of society how cannabis can have a very active and very compelling or very high impactful benefit to our industries, our communities? That could be on the one side around, establishing some evidence base, so that when we talk about the employment creation potential, we aren't just sort of talking about it in theoretical terms, to be able to say, for every hectare that you plant, we'll have 3 permanent jobs. 2 of them will come during the harvest season, and those might be temporary jobs, in the secondary sector. This is what we're looking at in terms of job creation. And then actually something that's sort of an integrated project, so people can actually visualize, what does that value addition look like, right, across the whole cycle? Where does the seed start off? How do you grow it? What are the opportunities for being able to invest in the R&D capability to turn those into different kinds of commercial products for different industry verticals? That's something to be able to see that, I think, is something that is really, really, really important. And in some ways, there are businesses, I think Hemporium has been able to do this, of course, have been in the industry for quite a long time. But for many other businesses, you don't have that benefit of being able to have this long track record to be able to demonstrate the impact that we're talking about. But I think some investment that would go a long way is for the private sector to work together with labor, with community, to actually demonstrate what these kinds of pilots can look like. Because once you're able to then demonstrate or prove the models, it's much easier to make a case for their replication or their scaling. So I would say those are some of the ways in which we might sort of work a little bit better to get government to move quicker. But I really do think, fundamentally, Garth, if you have the let's say the trajectory of the cannabis industry being led by single departments, we're going to run into a major problem. There's already a global precedent of coordination, for example, at like a presidential level, right? It's so critical for us to actually be able to have somebody that has the gravitas to be able to convene all of these various departments, and also to be able to steer them, with actually some kind of authority. At the moment, we don't have that. And that's the reason why it's very difficult, if you had this idea of like a commercial bill. Tony was talking about what they've done in Malawi. We don't have that, right? And that's actually an area that's really missing. We would think potentially the DTIC could sort of push some of that, but without sort of some of that convening like power, I think we're going to be stuck with these conversations that are really endless. And they're just really circular. So those are some of the ways that I think we can make some practical contributions to moving things forward.
Important observations from all three of the panelists. Would anybody like to circle back onto those issues? I think the key things that are coming out is the necessity for a federation of associations, notwithstanding the constraint that Ayanda has spoken about. And then I think the whole issue of litigation, as uncomfortable as it may be, is something that the panelists are suggesting should be kept on the table. I think Ayanda's raised something important and perhaps new for me, which is the mobilization of elected officials. Perhaps we could add to that the mobilization and education, for want of a better word, of elected officials, and a lobbying and advocacy effort in relation to the centers of power, including Parliament. And I know a lot of this has already taken place. And then Ayanda has given some more meat to the notion of a demonstrator effect, and that's the fourth issue that's been raised. And then I think perhaps the most important thing of all is the complicated and multiple institutional environment and departments involved. I mean, I think one of the successes, or perhaps the main reason for the success of the automotives and clothing and textile master plans, is that there was only one department involved. That was the DTIC. The moment you get other departments involved, you run across this problem of so-called joined up government policy coherence, turf battles, and so on and so forth. And so perhaps one of the things we should be thinking about as an industry, as investors, as small-scale farmers, and so on and so forth, is what are the key demands that we want to place before government? And I think Ayanda has put at the top of that list the necessity for a central institutional mechanism of some kind, which ensures that the institutional fragmentation and lack of coherence is addressed as some kind of urgency. But colleagues, back to you, Tony, Pierre.
Yeah, I think that you hit the nail on the head when you spoke about the multiple ministries that we having to engage with. If we look at the Hemp Foundation, or the Hemp Foundation that's been trying to push this forward over the years, it had, I think, 7 different departments that were all trying to get together, all trying to find consensus, and all even trying to meet. It's definitely had Department of Health, it had obviously Justice, DAF, DTI, Rural Development, and and science and technology all have an interest in this space. And I think what we're going to suddenly see, and we're already starting to see a little bit of it, that as soon as it becomes a reality and there's some budget going to be allocated, everyone's going to be clamoring to hold on to it. But for the last 20 odd years, they've been passing it around like a hot potato. No one's wanted to hold on to this cannabis thing because it's too complex. But it's very interesting now to see this momentum, to finally see it, to have the president declare it government policy in Parliament, and that was over 2 years ago. Obviously, now we've had COVID putting everything on ice for a while, but it doesn't mean that we should be going this slowly. And this is as I said, it's an affront to the industry and to the people who have already invested. There's a lot of money that's already been invested in this country to get this going, and a lot of businesses that have set things up. There are a lot of licenses who've already cultivated, but because of the regulations, can't find a market. So there is cause for people to now get in and really support the final push, to get these enabling regulations, and to support all the different industry bodies that are trying to form, who need some budget to do this. It's unfair to put the responsibility on these individual companies to take on the might of the government or the lethargy on some avenues of the government. So I think this is a call to arms. I think at this Indaba, we will see a lot of people who, as I said, this is for me the real opportunity. Cultivation is an opportunity, but manufacturing, those who are going to be able to create products out of this plant, that is the key aspect to it, and is where you'll see a lot of the energy flow. And these companies that work in sectors like housing, like nutrition, like medicine, the textile industry, if you want to think of how South Africa can get a foothold in the international industry, not trying to compete with cheap and nasty and putting us between India and China at the international pavilions, but celebrating that we have strong unions and we pay more or less a living wage to our people in the industry, and celebrating that we use organic, natural, and environmentally friendly textiles like hemp. We've got something to sell. Made in South Africa in the textile industry, if we're working with organic textiles and we pay a living wage compared to India and China, we have a unique selling point to Europe. Then we can celebrate our unions instead of thinking, oh, they cause problems. Then we can say, okay, well, let's really push that as made in South Africa, has integrity, living wage, natural and organic. We peg our hat on that, and we say we are going to be proud of what made in South Africa means. Not, as I said, trying to compete with the East. We cannot do that. We've already put ourselves out of that with the push towards living wages in the sector. And that's the way we can claw some of those jobs that we lost back from the East, by really building a sustainable industry built on ethics and integrity and environmental friendliness. So these are some of the key points, that the opportunities that we have. And I really hope that the outcomes of this Indaba and hopefully this conversation will plant the seeds in some industrialist minds of the opportunity in the space, and the need for some investment just to open up this last little leg of nudging the government towards the enabling regulations that will allow us to flourish.
Yeah. I think we must also, there are a couple of green shoots. I'm seeing some interesting developments at provincial government level, where the provinces led by their premiers are going, we're no longer happy with what's happening at national level, and we're doing what we can within their sphere of influence. Now, maybe it's a little bit easier at a provincial level to coordinate these complex different departments, but we're seeing some real movement at provincial level. There's a lot of money going into agriculture, agro-processing, horticulture, which is promising for the industry. And there's a number of them that have come out and said that they're developing cannabis hubs. We're also seeing some of the provinces are saying, where can we start? We want to start at the bottom. We want to build the industry from the bottom. So they're starting to put money into training and other areas of development, which is promising. So, yeah, I think there are some sort of green shoots coming, and it's now a matter of everybody putting their little bit together and working together cooperatively and in a positive way. The opportunity can't be missed. We as leaders in this industry, and I'm including government and private sector, really have an obligation not to delay this any longer. There's an article came out now, I just saw it, where the head of the tax society has just made an announcement that cannabis, we need to move. It's tax revenue for the government. So I think the momentum's building and we just need to keep it going.
Colleagues, we've raised 8 things: the Federation of Associations, the possibility of litigation, the mobilization of elected officials, the demonstrator effect, the key demands for an integrated and not disaggregated approach. Tony's raised the important issue of ethical trade opportunities. Pierre has raised the fact that, notwithstanding national government lethargy, provincial governments are starting to get their act together. My own view is that the fiscus is under really significant constraint, and the possibilities of getting government money for industry associations may be extremely limited. So what are the possibilities of a crowdfunding initiative or angel investor support on the back of a really well-motivated set of arguments for why this sector has the enormous potential to address the most significant problems of rural poverty and unemployment? Because I think I'm again returning to the issue of the risks associated with expectations that government will move quickly, including with respect to financing. Any inputs in that regard?
I know if you go, I'll come in later.
No, okay, thanks, Pierre. Look, there are opportunities to look elsewhere around the financing issue, but obviously, if you're looking at angel investors or any kind of investor, the main metric is the return they get from that investment, which at the moment is something that's difficult, for example, to quantify, especially when you're talking about associations. Some of the challenges, for example, on the crowdfunding side, I mean, we at Friends of Hemp, we're looking at crowdfunding for a bit of litigation around some of the restrictions in the Drugs Act and the Medicines Act. And you come up against the issue that the kind of the major platforms, right, that would allow you to have kind of the mass reach that you require, all prohibit like cannabis or hemp advertising, as they call it. And so, for example, the Facebook related platforms all prohibit any kind of activity around the promotions of cannabis and hemp. So it can be a little bit restrictive on that front. But I wanted to steer a little bit to something that I think is really important, and I've noticed in a couple of convenings we don't really talk enough about this, which is that from my perspective, I'm an economist and I'm really interested in trade and in industrial policy. One of the things for me is around how do you actually build out some kind of policy for competitiveness, right? Because I think at the moment, a lot of the way that we're moving in the industry is sort of, invest in this bit of the value chain, get the farmers going, provide them support. But I think there's been insufficient emphasis placed on trying to imagine how we actually are going to be a competitive industry 10, 15, 20 years down the line of, notwithstanding some of the constraints we have, on the textile side, for example, the big competition from the East. But what are those areas in which we might actually have some comparative advantage that we might be able to exploit pretty much immediately, So a simple example is, we know that there is a huge presence, of the automotive industry in South Africa, huge implications in terms of contributions to GDP, job creation, and whatnot. The composites, right, that are used to manufacture those cars are generally made here, but with parts and pieces that are imported from somewhere else. Is there a way, for example, we might be able to actually look at the automotive industry as a particularly interesting area to focus on, where we might have a comparative advantage that maybe begins on the agriculture side, be able to produce at low cost. In some cases, you're going to use non-woven and the quality is not as important as if you're making apparel, but to use that to import substitute, feed into like already industries for which there is demand and for which there is actually the manufacturing capability. The reason why the commercialization is really important is because cannabis is not yet a commodity market. We're not talking about farmers just going and growing like maize, and then eventually somebody in the futures market will, grab up the stock that you've got. The exchange is basically by private treaty. So you need to actually really be thinking about, well, once you've opened up the floodgates and you have all of this biomass that's on the market, how do we actually ensure that can be translated into like real products that are commercially viable, that can allow us to be competitive? That's something that for me at the moment in cannabis industry is significantly missing. And what happens when we do that is we miss those niche opportunities that allow South Africa to be actually quite unique. So we don't talk, for example, about the huge impact that hemp can have, or cannabis can have, on the agenda around climate change and emissions reductions, and the deals, COP is coming up. There isn't as much of a discussion around, well, what does that look like? How do we commercialize that kind of activity? So this is really where I think the DTIC really needs to kind of step up, because once you have, right, this idea of like, this is where we want to be able to focus, either segments, product categories, certain geographies, then it makes it much easier to work backwards on, well, what's the kind of support that you require, right, to make that happen? What are the different kinds of standards? We don't have standards and regulations. It's very difficult even for licensed cannabis manufacturers to actually have consistent results from labs, because we don't have standard testing protocols. There are lots of other issues where, you need to think about, well, what does the support need to look like here? Because the thing that we need to get out of our minds is that this is not sort of a singular like island industry. It actually has a lot of overlap with a number of existing industries, right, in adjacent sectors. So what is it that we can do to be able to piggyback off of that? Because mind you, if you're having an issue, for example, with logistics for agro-processing, well, you're going to have the same kinds of challenges for cannabis. It isn't sort of magically something else is going to happen. So how do we start thinking about even the master plan around how we become competitive? How do we ensure our position on the global stage? And I think that kind of shift in thinking is something that can get us a little bit further down the line, especially when we start thinking about, in South Africa, you have very interesting, for example, R&D investment, whether that's in like biofibers or guys at Stellenbosch who are doing fractionation to get nanocrystalline cellulose, or folks who are looking at the landscaping for like post-mining economies that are rehabilitated using hemp. A lot of this research is actually happening, but it's very, very fragmented, and none of it is really guided by, okay, these are the areas that we really want to play in. So let's actually put a lot of resource behind these. So sorry to have cut you off, Pierre, and to have sort of shifted the conversation a little bit, but it's especially because we are speaking around the need to develop this manufacturing and processing capability. That conversation needs to be a little bit different to the one that in general, I think in the industry we've been having.
Thank you very much, Ayanda. Important addition. Tony, would you like to come in at this point?
No, I think one thing that's clear for me on this panel is again, we have the resources, we have the experience. We are not totally 100% all in agreement on everything, but we are 99% in this, heading in the same direction. And to find consensus amongst the different stakeholders is necessary, but not that difficult, especially when we look at it at what we want from the industry. It gets very murky when we start looking at like the opening up, obviously, of the recreational use, the human rights angle. There's so many different viewpoints from religious standpoints, conservative standpoints, legal things that need to be changed, but and obviously very important conversations that need to happen. And have the human rights angle, as I said earlier, you're stopping the war on drugs and the abuse of the communities that use this plant and the cultures that have been using them for centuries. But as a setting up of an industry, there are already rules in place and regulations that we can abide by to create products that are safe for consumption, products that are safe for using in housing. Like it's not inventing anything new. It's opening up something that already exists. The material, as I said, it's one of those few plants that humans have carried around the world over the last 10,000 years. It's been spread to Norway, from Norway to New Zealand and everywhere in between. We've taken it there because it's a useful plant. It's a companion plant for humans. It gives us so many of our needs. And it is just really one of these cases that I think if government would actually get out the way, we can self-regulate. As an industry, we as I said earlier already, we want to create a sustainable business. We want to create a sustainable industry. We want to see the jobs created. We want products that are made with integrity, ethically, with standards, all of that. It's literally that keyword, enabling. Can we enable this industry? Can we create legislation that just gives us the opportunity to show that this isn't going to be the chaos that the propaganda against the plant has always said will happen if we unleash it. We've seen it done in other countries. We've seen mistakes made that we can learn from. And as I said, it is not going to be too hard for us to do something that's really going to make positive change in this country if we were just given the chance. So, yeah.
Thank you very much, Tony. And I think that it's you've ended on an appropriate note, given that we've also run out of time. So I'm going to ask Pierre and Ayanda just to make some closing remarks, which I think you've done very well. If there are other issues which the other two panelists wish to raise, in circumstances where I think we've put probably 9 or 10 key issues on the table, so to speak, some of which are new, others might not be so new. And those include the issue which Ayanda has raised, which is a policy for competitiveness. And I think that brings a hugely important issue. Sometimes framing policy, even with the most appropriate slogans, has a hugely important impact. A policy for competitiveness frames, I think, what we need to do in a sunrise sector. And from that flow a whole lot of other things, because competitiveness is absolutely critical, whether it's in rail or in automotives or clothing and textiles. And unfortunately, with the exception of some sectors, mainly services sectors, banking, other parts of the South African economy, especially in value-added manufacturing sectors, we've lost competitiveness. So I think that's a hugely important strategic issue to be raising amongst the other issues that have been raised. And then, of course, the issue, which has also been added, which I think we're all aware of, but it's very important to highlight it, is that there's massive overlap or complementarities with other primary sectors, both in agriculture, in logistics, and in the tertiary sectors, as well as manufacturing. And the competency and capabilities often exist. It's about how to marshal those and get government to support them. Here are some closing remarks.
Yeah, thanks, Garth. I think my message is the genie's out the bottle. Prohibition is ending. It's coming. We've got to free the plant. It's a single plant with up to 50,000 products that can come from a single plant. We need to get plants in the ground, and we need to appear in these kind of forums where we talk about manufacturing, processing, value adds, competitive strategies. We need the investors in the room. We've already got a competitive advantage in my mind. Africa is very suited for cannabis. It's deeply embedded in our history, and we already have the skills and we already have the market. We must ignore the past, ignore the stigma, hopefully understand how ludicrous this illegality of this plant actually is. And the time is now. So let's take it forward to the next level. And we really hope that some of the big manufacturing companies, some of the big players, some of the big private sector businesses, funds, banks come to the party. It'll be good for the country. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ayanda, any closing remarks?
Yeah, Garth, thank you. Again, I think just maybe one last point to mention, because I think we are trying to also build and capitalize on something that is truly an African industry, or at least one with a very African character. And it occurs to me that if we're talking about manufacturing and trade, one thing to mention is that we have also missed a little bit of the opportunity of thinking about regional economic integration with regards to creating a market for local products. The southern cone of the continent is among the most pioneering regions. When you've seen, we've had so much liberalizing legislation over the last couple of years, and yet not a single jurisdiction speaks to another. And I think that's also where we have particular problems around access to market, harmonizing standards, being able to have to gain greater concessions on a global stage. This idea that, we have Lesotho inside of our country, and we actually don't really think about what that trade looks like, even though informally that trade has existed for centuries. So I want to just say, let's not forget the aspect around trade and sort of the importance that cannabis does serve on the continent, and how we can not just as a single market go out and try and make or shape the industry, but we can do it really as a body of countries sort of with very similar objectives. I think overall, we are very excited about the prospects, obviously, of the industry and how it has been growing. I think what we certainly would require is, again, even though we might have differences in how we approach certain things, but I think we really need to all pull in the same direction. And I think as long as we appear particularly fragmented, we're sort of inviting the opportunity for divide and conquer politics that are really not going to get us anywhere. So thank you again for the opportunity to be able to engage with you, Garth, and with Pierre and Tony. Thank you.
Colleagues, thank you very much. It's been a great privilege for me to moderate this session with panelists with the range and depth of knowledge and experience that you have. So first of all, to extend on behalf of the manufacturing Indaba our thanks to you as panelists. I think it's been a very useful, interesting, informative and provocative discussion. I think it's one step in a process which Tony, much to his credit, has been fighting for decades. And I think in many ways, you as panelists have suggested that we mustn't give up the fight. There's a wave now, there's a global wave. It's about ensuring that South Africa develops the kind of enabling environment for investment and job creation and addressing rural poverty. These things are never easy. There are no guarantees of success. We need unity, we need combined voices, and we need clearly articulated policies and strategies in support of and working with government, labor, the community and business. And so, colleagues, without further ado, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Garth.